So there are a lot of ways to make a rendering, but here's a pretty easy way to do it using a combination of Rhino and Photoshop. First, in your Rhino model, go ahead and switch to a perspective viewport, because since we're using Photoshop in an actual photo, we want the perspectives to match up. Great. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and pick a nice view of the object, or the wall, or whatever it is. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is, press A, just to recenter my camera because I don't have a mouse with me today. I'm going to go ahead and find a pretty nice, good looking view of the object. And I think this looks like a pretty good angle. It's about eye level, and it's going to show us a good kind of approach view. And I think it looks, it shows a lot of the object. So I think I'm pretty happy with this. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I am going to go to the site and I'm going to grab a photo. So that's what I've done. I've taken a photo at about the same level from about the same angle. I think this is a perfectly good photo to use. A good tip when you're doing this is to take a photo that's slightly wider than your perspective in every direction, so that if you need to, wider than you plan your rendering to be in every direction. So if you need to crop it, then you can. But let's just go ahead and use this photo. So the way that I want to do this render is I want to do a kind of a photo collage where I'm going to drop a rendering of my Rhino model over a photograph of the site that we just showed. So I want to make sure that those perspectives all match up. And I think the easiest, or one easy way to do that, is to just simply use Rhino to match the angle and the view of the perspective of the photo to the model. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change my background to that photo. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my display mode, and I'm just going to pick a display mode that's easy to work with. For now, it's going to be shaded. And for the background, I'm going to say use image file. And I've already selected this image from my computer, so it's already there, but you just have to browse to it and find it. So you'll notice right off the bat that the perspectives in here don't match. And you'll know that because, well, it starts to look like this angle down here is kind of convincing, but clearly the vanishing point of this image, if we kind of trace this with our eye, right, is somewhere over here. And if we follow that same line of the top of this object, the vanishing point is somewhere up, it's much higher. So, and the reason for this is because the lens length that Rhino is using for the Rhino camera is different than the lens length of the camera that we used to capture this image with. Now, a really easy way to fix this is to just know what the lens length of your camera was, which if you're using a digital SLR or some like a camera with an actual physical lens on it, you can just look at the lens or grab the image info from the photo. And if it's digital, and it will usually tell you what the lens length was. If you're using an iPhone, then you can just Google what the lens length of your iPhone is. I shot this with an iPhone SE 2, and the lens length of that is something like 25 millimeters. Right? Okay, so now you'll see I've got a vanishing point that's much closer to whatever my actual perspective was. And I can move this around and fiddle with it. And if you don't know what that information is, you can just continue to mess with the lens length over here and get it pretty close. And then what I'm going to do is I can adjust this until I get about where I want to go and get a realistic rendering. And then because I've already done that, I'm going to go into my saved views and grab it. And there we go. I think that's pretty close. And that's the view that I'm going to use for this rendering. Something that will make your life a whole lot easier throughout this process is once you find this, whatever this view is that you want, because you're probably going to be doing some trial and error here, and you're going to want to re-export this if you need to fix something or change something, then do yourself a favor and save this. Because if you ever start messing around with this, it's going to be a real pain to get it just right all over again, because it takes a little bit of tweaking. So just go ahead, save the view so you can recall it whenever you want and have it be just right all the time. So now that we've got the view set up, we can start to think about how we're going to represent the object's material. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do this depending on what rendering engine you're using, but if you're using Rhino Render or Enscape, then the best way to do it is to do it by material here in the file. And the easiest way to do that is to move everything that's going to be one material onto its own layer, and then everything that's going to be other materials onto their own layers, and then just to assign the layers themselves the material. So for example, what you'll notice is down here I've got these two different layers. We've got the whole wall layer and the hardscaping layer, right? If I turn off the hardscaping turns off. If I turn off the wall layer turns off, right? And what I've done is I can go over here, if I expand this a little bit, and I expand this a little bit, I've got this whole materials column here, right? you can see I can assign different materials to this object that will assign different materials to that, or sorry, different materials to these layers that will apply different materials to the objects on those layers. So for example, maybe I want my hardscaping to look concrete. Well, then what I can do here, and depending on how your computer is set up, your menu here might be a little bit different, is I can go into, well, first of all, let's just go ahead and remove this material, right? And just change it to default material so we can get through this whole process from step one. So right now, when I start, I've got no material. So if I go here, I can choose from a couple of different materials, or I can go down here and choose from these other different materials. And then for some reason, there's another menu where I can choose from even more materials if I click more types, and it opens another menu where I can go to import. And now I've got even more options. And I don't know why these menus are set up in this way. I really don't know. But there's a lot of stuff built into Rhino that has these kind of old menus like this every once in a while, and this is one of them. I can't explain why it's like this, but there are actually a lot of materials in here that are really helpful. So for example, maybe I want this hardscaping to be concrete. Then if I go down to architectural and I go to floor, well, there's no concrete in here because concrete is for in the walls, and I go to concrete, and then now I've got all these different concretes I can pick through. And I don't know where all these materials live. You might have to hunt for them. You can also make your own, which I'll show you in a second. So maybe I want concrete light, and I'll say okay, and I'll say apply. And you'll notice that nothing changes in this view, and that's because I'm in the rendered viewport or the shaded viewport. But if I go down to the rendered viewport, then I've got kind of a concrete texture down here. Now, when you're working with materials, it's important to make sure that you're working with materials whose pattern is represented at an appropriate scale, which in this case it is. So the other thing that I can do is maybe I want this whole wall to be concrete, or maybe I want it to be something like Corten steel, which I think looks really cool. Now, really, if you were going to make this wall, you'd probably make it out of concrete because all of these shapes look like they came out of they would be easier to cast rather than to form out of metal, out of hollow metal. But I think this would look cooler as Corten, and for the purposes of this demonstration, that's what it is. So let me show you how to do that, because that is not a material that's built into Rhino. I made this texture myself by finding images of Corten steel on the internet and making a very large, high-resolution image of that in Photoshop by stitching all of those images together. So once I did that and I had this nice, big, beautiful Corten image file, then what I did was I came down in here, right? And if I go down, and let's go ahead and let's change this back to the default material so we can take a look at how to make this thing from scratch. So then after I made my image file, I can go down here to to picture is my material, right? And then I can just browse to whatever that picture that I made was, and I've got all sorts of stuff that I use in here. So for example, if I look at Corten 3, which is this old file that I have, you'll notice that this looks bad because the size of the image that I'm using is too small for the object, and it's starting to stretch it. So if you have this problem, then you need to use a different image because otherwise your rendering will look silly. And that's exactly why I made this other one. So if I go back into here, there it is. Sorry. And I go back to Corten, which is my good Corten picture, and I apply it. You'll notice that this grain pattern is much, much better. Because this image has a much higher resolution, and I think that looks a lot nicer. Okay, cool. So I've messed around with this a little bit. You know, it's my angle is gone. I don't know how to make sure it looks good in my when I overlay it on my picture. That's okay because I saved it. So I'm gonna go back to my saved views, and there we go. There is my view. And if I want to confirm that it looks good, then I can just go back to my viewport properties, and I can change my background back to an image. Let's choose this image file, demos, rendering, and courtyard. There we have it. Okay, cool. So that looks pretty good. So this is going to give me kind of a preview of how my Photoshop file can look once I'm done. So what I'm going to do now that I know that this is at about the right angle and the materials look pretty good is I am going to go ahead and render it. I'm just going to turn the background off for now because I don't need it. It makes my computer run a little slower. So now what I can do is I can go to the render command. So if I go to render properties, there are lots of different things that I can choose from here. What I want to make sure, first of all, is that my rendered dimensions here are big enough to where I can put this on a board without having it look bad. So that's the first thing to do, is figure out what size image you need to make in order to make an image that's big enough to go on a board and look good. Usually I just select whatever the biggest option here is, and it's often enough, but in your case it might not be. So go ahead and plan out what this is going to be and figure out how big an image count, or sorry, how large a pixel count you're going to need to make it happen. The other thing that you'll want to do is probably bump up the DPI to at least 150. You might want to do it even higher. This is going to depend on how large this object ends up being on your board. Not only just the render itself, but at the actual object. You may have to do some experiments with this. So for the background, what I would suggest that you do is select the transparent background option, which is not selected by default. And this is because we know we're going to Photoshop this over a Photoshop background. Okay, the other thing that you can do here is you can enable a sun. Now, sun is a little bit tricky to work with in Rhino, especially if you're using no material and you're just going to leave it white, because it tends to wash out a lot of stuff. Right now I'm running the sun intensity at about 0.5. If I turn on, but what this will let us do is this will let us add shadows, which are really, really helpful. You'll notice also that if I go back and I turn my background back to the image file, what I've gone ahead and done is in the sun settings down here, I've changed the orientation of the sun so that the shadows sort of match the shadows that are happening in this courtyard. That's one of those things you should just take a look at before you run this, because if you've got shadows going in different directions in your rendering, then it'll look silly. Another thing that you want to pay attention to is all of these things with the curves and the surface edges. You probably want to have those turned off unless for some reason you really want to show all those little curves, but you probably don't. Okay, so now that's done. What we can do is we can go ahead and do a render preview. And this is going to take a little bit of time. Rhino render is not super speedy. Enscape is a lot faster, but this is easy and you already have it and it works pretty well. And the reason I'm going to go ahead and do a preview here is because I just want to make sure that nothing is completely washed out here and that the colors look relatively reasonable. There we go. So what this is telling me here is that I'm still getting some shadows here. Nothing is completely, sometimes when you turn the sun on, it tends to just totally blast all these white surfaces and you'll lose all the shadow and all the resolution. This is a little bit more washed out than I would like. I might want to tweak that sun a little bit, but the core 10 part looks good. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I think that's good enough. So I'm just going to bail on this preview. Sure, that's fine. I will stop it. And your computer might sound like an airplane at this point. And if it doesn't yet, then it definitely will after we go to render and tell it to render it for real. So for a while, it's probably going to look like nothing's happening, and it might not be. And this could take a while. You might want to run your render quality on draft first, just to make sure that it doesn't take too long. I think it took my computer last night about 20 minutes to render this thing. On draft quality. On good quality, it takes even longer. But you can see it actually does look really good. And we get these shadows in here. This texture looks really nice. So I'm pretty happy with the way that this is progressing. Again, it's on pass 4 out of 50. It'll slowly kind of degranularize all this stuff given enough time. But I'm just going to go ahead and cancel it because the steps are documented. Okay, so now I'm back in Photoshop. I've got my background in here, and I'm going to go ahead and I've already placed my render into this file, so I'll turn that layer on. And now when I move it down to where I wanted it to be, it looks about right. So now what I need to do is figure out how to get some of these other little bits and pieces in here in the background tidied up. And you can see I've kind of shot this photo and set up this rendering so where I have kind of the minimal amount of processing that I need to do. But I might want to do something like, change the way that this grass is represented, or in this area in the back of the rendering where I've got kind of my hardscaping zigzagging off over this Liriope patch and all this other overlapping on this other sidewalk, then I probably want to clean that up. So what I might want to do is go back through and maybe delete this grass or delete this part or replace this with a pattern fill or do something more artistic. And the other thing that I'm going to want to do, of course, is to add scale figures. Or what I might want to do is to abstract the background a little bit by either lowering the opacity, and maybe what I want to do is to get a good sense of how that's going to look, I'll slide another layer under that and just make that layer white so I can get a good sense of how that's going to look, and that kind of softens it a little bit. Or maybe what I want to do is make everything black and white. So if I add a new layer, whoops, not that, this one, and I do something like, well, you can just convert everything to black and white, but I find that I have a little bit more control and a little bit more creative freedom if I do it a different way. What I like to do is to do a gradient map. And a gradient map will convert everything into a two-color image that you can map as you see fit. So it has, for whatever reason, chosen cyan and white to be the color of this gradient map, and that's probably just whatever the last one I was using was. So if I change cyan to black, and I reverse these stops, then I've got a black and white image here, and I can adjust my thresholds to lighten or darken the image. Now, what I'm doing now is because I applied this map over the topmost layer of this thing, then what you're going to see here, and if I go ahead and just say okay and just bail on this thing, then what this has done is this adjustment layer is going to apply to every single layer underneath it, right? Now, if I double click on or right click on it or two-finger click on it or control click on it or whatever your computer you're using does for a right click, and I do this in a way where I select this option and I say create clipping mask, then what it's going to do is it's going to apply this filter just to the layer right underneath it, right? So because this rendering is the layer right underneath it, then it's converted the rendering to black and white. If I wanted to apply it instead to the background, then I would move it so it's directly over the background layer. And then what I can do is, like, maybe if I want to, maybe I don't want black and white, maybe I want a different color. So I can just double click on this here, re-click my gradient map, and maybe I want this to be pink and white. And I'll use my usual FF6699 is my go-to pink, this Pepto pink here. And then there you go. And there's a pink and white rendering. And if I change this again, so say okay, scoot out of the way, go back here. And so again, if I move this and I change this so that it's, depending on where I have this adjustment layer, then I can change my mapping. And again, what I might want to do is change the way that this is weighted, right? The way that these stops are weighted. So I click here, I can change these thresholds, right? And what you can see is the way that the background here is affected is disproportionate to, or it's proportionate, but it doesn't look the same as the way that the foreground layer is affected. So maybe what I want to do here is I want to create this as a clipping mask here for that layer. And then what I want to do for the background layer is I want to do another one down here. And I'll say gradient map. And I'll create another clipping mask for that layer down there. And then maybe I just want black and white for that one. Okay, and again, I've done it backwards by accident, so I'll just invert it. Whoop, down there, and let's get this, maybe not quite so stark. Oh, sorry. Okay, let's grab this. So it can be a little bit of, require a little bit of fine tuning. Let's just go with that for now. And then let's tweak the other one also. So maybe there's a little bit less pink. All right, so I'm having trouble getting it to so it's not washed out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another adjustment layer where I can tweak the contrast, right? So I'm going to add this, and I'm going to say brightness and contrast, right? And you'll notice that since it's below the gradient map layer, right, then what this will do is it'll affect how the gradient map appears and how this pink and white image appears here. So if I just change the way that the contrast on here is, I can jack up the contrast a little bit. Maybe I want to increase or decrease the brightness. And this might help those edges read a little bit better. So there's any number of tweaks that you can do to help bring out some of this texturing and these edges in your model. All right, so there we go. That is another way that you can create kind of a more artistic image here. Be careful though, of course, with the way that you're going to represent your stuff, because if you actually want this thing to read as being Core 10, and that's an important part of your project, then representing it as pink, it doesn't make any sense. So you'll just want to turn those off, and then we're back to the Core 10.